Okay, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. My name is Chantal de Jong-Oudhat. I'm the president of Women in International Security, also known as WISE. Welcome to this policy roundtable discussion that will focus on human trafficking and modern slavery. We have a terrific panel of experts from different parts of the world to help us understand the issue and talk about policy responses. But before I introduce our panelists, I would like to introduce Ambassador Kurt Jäger, the ambassador of Liechtenstein to the United States. The Liechtenstein embassy has been a long-standing partner in this series of roundtable discussions that examine national and international security challenges from a gender and a women, peace and security perspective. A perspective that is too often ignored, particularly in policy discussions here in the United States. I would like to thank Ambassador Jäger and his colleagues at the embassy, most notably Matthew Keller, for their support throughout the years and for helping us really mainstream gender in these policy discussions. Tonight, we're talking about human trafficking and modern slavery, which is another policy priority issue for Liechtenstein. Ambassador Jäger, I would like to invite you to say a few words, including a few words about why this is an important issue for Liechtenstein. Ambassador Jäger. We can't hear you.
Well, thank you, Chantal. Welcome to everybody. Very proud to have such a large audience today. I've heard, I think, Chantal, it's about 190 people. That's quite remarkable. Welcome to a good age with the internet and electronics. Difficult to do that when everybody has to be physically present. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to join in these recent efforts to raise the awareness of the role of the financial sector in combating modern slavery and human trafficking, which has become today a major source of crimes, transborder and national, whatever you mean it, and becomes also a serious threat to, I think, global security. I'm very grateful to you, Chantal, and the entire team of WISE for teaming up with the Embassy of Liechtenstein to organize discussions like the one today, and for bringing such a distinguished group of panelists together every time. It's really remarkable. The WISE audience has proved actually to be a critical audience to reach out as we work to improve the understanding of gender-related aspects of human rights. And our years-long relationship with WISE, which now I think it's in its 5th year, has focused a great deal on one of the major foreign policy areas of Liechtenstein, as you mentioned, Chantal, namely women, peace and security, the agenda of the United Nations on the matter. And this has been a common endeavor to raise the awareness of gender perspectives and to address the many systemic challenges and nuanced layers also that need to be recognized when striving for progress in this difficult area. The WPS agenda is very much a human rights agenda, which again forms another key component of my country's foreign policy focus. And although the manufacturing industry is the largest contributor to Liechtenstein's GDP, it's compared to other European and Western countries a small share of it. The financial sector is also a significant component of our economy, of course. And over the years, Liechtenstein has experienced the good and the bad sides of having a successful financial sector industry. And the country has taken, therefore, numerous reforms of the oversight of its financial sector to expand the scope of the efforts to combat financial crimes. And as we, along with other international partners, have focused on combating illicit activities such as money laundering and terrorist financing and drug trafficking, it also became apparent that there were significant gaps when it comes to combating human trafficking and modern slavery. And it was important to raise the awareness and shift the culture of how we view financial networks today and their unfortunate, though largely, of course, unintentional roles in enabling human trafficking and modern slavery. At the same time, we had to recognize the great potential for financial networks when it comes to choking off not only vital resources that allow these heinous acts of human rights violations, but also the ability of the financial sector to aid and to empower those who may fall victim to human trafficking and modern slavery to find other avenues for the achievement of economic prosperity. And in 2017, therefore, the stakeholders from Liechtenstein, the United Nations University, including James Cockayne, who's with us today as a speaker, brought together a wide-ranging and diverse group of people from the public and the private sectors to meet at Grace Farms in Connecticut to embark on a thorough exchange of ideas and development of potential solutions to fight the plight of modern slavery. And the result was the publication of these 25 keys to unlock financial chains of human trafficking and modern slavery. And therein, their recommendations for the formation of a multi-stakeholder financial sector commission to find ways to strengthen the sectoral knowledge, to improve the regulations, of course, to encourage also leadership and to promote information partnerships. The outcome of the endeavor has been the so-called Liechtenstein Initiative on Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, shortly called FAST, and its blueprint on the financing against modern slavery that was released in the fall of 2019 already. Time passes very quickly, I must say. I thought this was a couple of months ago. And I'm therefore very pleased that James Cockayne, the head of the secretariat of this FAST initiative, is with us today from distant Australia to give you all a more insight into the blueprint and its proposals. And the effectiveness of this endeavor ultimately depends on strong public and private partnerships. And it is promising that today this matter is gaining a wider attention than in the past, even including by the US government. As you know, last October, the Treasury Department in a report to Congress highlighted the efforts undertaken by the US financial institutions, many of whom actively participate, by the way, in the work of the FAST initiative in combating the financing of human trafficking. This is a complex problem area where development of effective solutions requires very nuanced approaches. There is always more that can be achieved in a multi-pronged approach. And I therefore look forward to also learning more about how technology in particular, a vital and traditional instrument of the financial sector, can play a significant role in fighting human trafficking and modern slavery. And with this, I thank you all and hand over the floor back to you, Chantal. Looking forward to discussions.
Thank you very much, Kurt. So let me introduce the panel that we have. They are in 3 different time zones. First, Jamila Biggio. I would say she is one of the US most well-known and foremost policy expert on human rights and gender equality issues. She's currently a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations that is headquartered in New York, where she also launched a study group on this issue with a report coming out in the next few months. Before joining the council, Jamila was the director for human rights and gender at the Obama White House National Security Council. And she was also the one who led the first interagency discussions on the first US National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. James Cockayne, as Ambassador Yeager mentioned, he's a truly global academic with positions in the UK, the University of Nottingham, UN University, IISS in London, the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and now in Australia. He is the head of the Liechtenstein FAST initiative and has a book coming out next month on human trafficking entitled Developing Freedom, the Sustainable Development Case for Ending Modern Slavery. Hannah Darton, who at the Business for Social Responsibility leads the Tech Against Trafficking initiative. Before joining BSR, the Business for Social Responsibility, she worked in the philanthropic sector and also worked on human trafficking issues in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Bay Area. And then last but not least, Leila Hashemi. She is a 2019 WISE Next Generation Fellow and a researcher at Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center at George Mason University, also known as TRAC. where she's currently working together with Louise Shelley on the illegal trade in antiquities. She's also professor of political science at Montgomery College. Her research, her personal research, very much focuses on the illicit trade, human trafficking, and corruption, and particularly in the Middle Eastern and North Africa region. So a terrific panel. What we will do is I will ask our panelists some questions. Maybe we will do 2 rounds to get our discussion started and then open it up for Q&A. And I would like to ask our audience to use the Q&A function. I have 2 colleagues who are monitoring the Q&A, Susie McLaughlin and Maeve Murphy. And so our panelists, you don't have to watch that function either. You can find full bios of our panelists in the chat function, where we have also put links to recent reports of the different organizations. So let's start. As the title says, we want to focus on the role of finance and technology. That's also an issue that was very much underscored, I think, in the latest report of the UN Secretary General on human trafficking. But before we delve into the role of finance and tech, I want to ask Jamila to set the stage. You know, when we think of human trafficking, we often think about the trafficking of women, but there are very many different types of human trafficking, and it's not just about sexual exploitation and abuse. So Jamila, can you give us a little bit of a sense of the different types of human trafficking, its scope, and then also why it is important for those of us who are interested in national and international security issues to pay attention to this issue? Jamila, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be with you all today. Happy to help set the stage on this issue. And it is a critical one, and I think a critical one to highlight the many ways in which it touches the foreign policy, national security, economic policy communities. It is often an issue that is looked at just through specific silos and through very specific policy lenses. I think it's important to take a step back and really look at the ways in which it influences foreign policy, economic growth, sustainable development, national security in a myriad of avenues, and why it therefore is really a policy priority for those communities to collectively address. So looking at human trafficking, so first kind of recognizing that this is both an egregious human rights violation, as well as a threat, as I said, to national security, economic growth, and sustainable development. It involves the recruitment, transportation, transfer, receipt of people through use of force, fraud, or coercion for purposes of exploitation. And one thing to note that, despite near universal condemnation of this crime, the number of victims remains high. The latest estimate is 40 million people are enslaved worldwide, numbers that are only growing in the face of heightened vulnerabilities caused by the COVID-19 crisis. We also see the problem of human trafficking being exacerbated further by the migration crisis and persistent conflict, all contributing to trafficking risks as well. And what this means is that roughly 1 in every 192 people alive today are in some kind of exploitation. So the effect is widespread. If we then break these numbers down and look at what the different forms of trafficking are, we see that the UN's International Labor Organization estimates that 25 million people are in situations of forced labor. And this means a whole range of sectors, from domestic workers to construction, manufacturing, agriculture, and fishing. It means different economic actors as well. So 16 million of those people are in situations related to the private economy, another 5 million in situations related to sexual exploitation, another 4 million by these estimates in situations related to state-sponsored forced labor, such as in North Korea, for example. We know that debt bondage is a significant factor, and this is where we see, for example, human smuggling becoming situations of forced labor and human trafficking, where people are smuggled, where they, it's a voluntary situation, but they now have such significant debt that they are forced into situations of exploitation and forced labor to repay those debts. And the other piece to note, as we're thinking about kind of framing this, is that 1 in 4 victims of forced labor is a migrant. So with an estimated 164 million migrant workers, that means millions of migrants are in modern slavery today, and tens of millions more are at risk of being in situations of trafficking. Again, significant as we look at how COVID is affecting the world of work. And then looking at kind of the next category is looking at, so I mentioned sex trafficking as part of that, and then 15 million people, primarily women and girls, are in situations of forced marriage, which the human trafficking community is just starting to think about as a form of trafficking forced labor. And it's a step the US government has not yet taken. So if you look at the US government TIP reports, they do not count forced marriage as a form of forced labor or of human trafficking. When we talk about women and girls and how they're affected by trafficking, they represent over 70% of all cases of modern slavery. People hear that, as you noted, Chantal, and immediately think of sex trafficking, which is true. Women and girls are highly affected by sex trafficking. They're also affected by forced marriage, as I mentioned, but they're also significant victims of labor trafficking, domestic work being one of the primary areas, as well as in other situations of forced labor. And the other piece just to note there is that it's not as if it's not as if sex and labor trafficking are always perfectly divided either. So women are in situations of forced labor where they may face sexual assault and harassment. And so these are, part of, it's important to understand that these are situations of exploitation and of an unbalanced power relationship, where those who are exploited have few rights and few avenues of being able to correct their situation. And that's a piece where we can talk about what's being done on the policy side of trying to help not only protect labor rights, protect freedom of association, protect the ability for workers to come forward and report and feel free to report without fear of deportation, for example, feel free to report if they are in situations of exploitation. On the intersection of women, peace, and security, which is, as you noted, another area of interest for the panel and the work that you are doing. This is just to note that while we see human trafficking occurring in all parts of the world, it does occur in very specific ways in conflict contexts. So across each of these categories, where we look at how sex trafficking is used as a tactic to generate profits for armed groups and extremist groups in situations of conflict, where we see military personnel and peacekeepers where they are deployed, we see rates of sexual exploitation increase. We see forced marriage increase in situations of conflict where families are desperate, economically desperate, and turn to forced marriage as a harmful coping strategy to be able to generate resources, or in hopes of placing their daughters in another, what they hope safer context. We see labor trafficking play out in specific ways, where we see armed groups using trafficking to generate revenue to support their operations, to aid reconstruction. We see the use of children by armed groups. So just to note that when we overlay a conflict lens on top of all of these different forms of trafficking, we see the ways in which human trafficking is used strategically to advance the power of armed and extremist groups, and in that way shapes the political economies of conflict. We see the Security Council start to take this on in the women, peace, and security space. So the first Security Council resolution looked specifically at the intersection of sexual violence, sexual slavery, as a tactic of terror, with ISIS as a prime example. So that is an area of intersection. I think there's a lot more work and policy work to be done. That comes back to kind of looking at what the implications are of human trafficking on national security. And, I mentioned the ways in which human trafficking is used as a funding mechanism for extremist organizations, how state-sponsored trafficking can help provide corrupt regimes a source of income. It can bolster their military capabilities. It can provide them an avenue to circumvent sanctions. And we also see human trafficking driving displacement and destabilizing communities, which again undermines development. And then, as I noted, when security forces and peacekeepers engage in sexual exploitation or other forms of human trafficking, it undermines international institutions and international cooperation. I know the next panelists will be speaking more about kind of broader forms, but just to note that as we look at the implications of human trafficking, there's its effects on national security. We also see its significant effects on economic growth. It's a $150 billion industry, generating, one of the world's most profitable crimes. That signals, that helps to fuel illegal and unregulated markets. It puts legally compliant private sector actors at a disadvantage. It eliminates tax revenue. It causes costs for countries that are now having to provide resources to help support human trafficking survivors, so direct costs of healthcare services, law enforcement, et cetera. So it does pose kind of a broad range of social and economic costs. We also see its effects on sustainable development, which I'm so excited for James's book to come out to really explore that more. But just to note that as kind of another key lens to look at the implications of human trafficking on our global goals of advancing sustainable development, really critical to see that connection. And then just a note on our track record, it is not, we are seeing a lot of progress in recent years for sure. We are 20 years now since there were major commitments through the Palermo Protocol and the start of various national laws, including in the United States, to have an agreed definition and agreed framework to address human trafficking. We see more progress kind of in the last few years with some new innovative approaches, technological tools to help address trafficking in supply chains, great financial tools that the others will talk about. So I think there's reason to hope that as we move forward, that we can see more progress in the next 20 years than to really try to invest resources that would be in line with the scale of this $150 billion problem.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Jamila. We'll come back to the sort of policy responses, but James, I want you to, set a little bit the stage. As Jamila said, this is a very profitable business. And the UN Secretary General has also, called it one of the most profitable criminal activities So what are we talking about? And then tie that in with the FAST initiative and how the financial sector is dealing with this issue. James.
Thanks so much, Dr. de Jong-Woetraert. Great to be with you.
Please
and
call me
with
Chantal.
Thank you, Chantal. Great to be with you. And hard act to follow, Jamila, always, but I'll do my best. She's very helpfully set the scene here. I mean, to go straight to your question, Chantal, what are we talking about here? I think one way of understanding this is that we're really talking about people's, not just their labor, but often their agency being stolen from them. Fundamentally, modern slavery and human trafficking are about people being treated as if they're owned by another person. It's not legal to own another person anymore. It used to be. And in some places, it's still normalized according to social norms, even if officially on the books, it's not legal. But what we're basically talking about, this range of different forms of exploitation, is the systematic treatment of one group by others as though the exploiter owned the agency or parts of the political and especially economic agency. So the ability to choose where and how and when you sell your labor, the ability to choose what you do with any money that you might earn. So your consumption, saving and investment patterns. And as a result, that's all a product of coercion, obviously. So we're going to hear more from Dr. Hashemi later about the key role that corruption plays, I think. I'm hoping, Dr. Hashemi, nodding, great. More about how corruption greases the wheels of systems that rely on illegality in that way. But as Jamila said, this is $150 billion in revenue that come from these kinds of practices globally. That makes it the third most profitable international crime after drug trafficking and trade in counterfeit goods globally. So it's very big business. And it happens wherever there are vulnerable people who can be systematically exploited. So from an anthropological or a sociological perspective, this is about domination. And that's why we see it often arising in situations of conflict, displacement, and so on. But from an economic perspective, it's a business proposition, right? It's a rentier system. If you can set up within an otherwise legal supply chain, a system that relies on taking people's labor against their will, then you're essentially capturing all the value from that work, whether it's domestic work or work in construction, as Jamila said, or in agriculture is a very high risk industry. You're capturing that value. That's a very profitable rentier system that you have in place. So the spillover impacts of that system don't just fall on the victims. We often think of this very much in terms of perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. But what we need to recognize is that actually those systems endure even in legitimate industries for several reasons. One is that they often reduce the prices of consumer goods. So actually, we may think we're bystanders, but if we're consuming goods that are relying on business models, whether it's food products that are picked by labor that's not being paid properly, or something else, for example, garments that are sewn with cotton that has been picked by forced labor, then we're actually benefiting from that. We're sustaining the system. But that's in the short term. In the long term, it turns out that actually we're all worse off, because these systems don't just leave the victims worse off, they actually depress the wages of even free workers in the community. They depress productivity. As Jamila said, they also connect to reductions in public revenue. And we're increasingly recognizing that where you find this kind of illegality, you find other kinds of illegal management practices, including environmental management. So there's some fascinating research been coming out of the University of Nottingham in particular, looking at how where you find large scale slavery and trafficking in a business sector, you are also likely to find increased environmental harm. Just another negative implication of this terrible phenomenon. Now, we're beginning to be able to measure that impact. It's in the area just of child marriage, one part of this basket of violations we describe as modern slavery and human trafficking, no lesser an authority than the IMF says that if we ended child marriage tomorrow, the countries in which we ended it, their GDP would increase by over 1%. That's just child marriage. And in a low growth environment, that's a pretty significant gain. So if we extrapolate that out, and there are some economists and econometricians who've privately been modeling this for all of forced labor and human trafficking, they reckon it would be around 3 to 5% GDP growth worldwide if we ended modern slavery and human trafficking, which is absolutely extraordinary, massive if we were able to achieve that. Now, there'd be a lot of upfront sunk costs, and there would be a lot of unhappy people. And this is the key point, and where we come back from the economic side to the political side. These systems endure because somebody is benefiting in the short term, the exploiters and those that are in support of them. And that brings us to the financial sector. The FAST initiative, which Ambassador Yeager so kindly introduced at the beginning, is really designed to get at the financial back end of the global economy. It recognizes that finance, banks, the businesses that are relying on modern slavery and human trafficking, and the individuals, the exploiters, $150 billion. Some of that, some large portion of that is being laundered through the global financial system. Secondly, the financial system lends to and invests in these businesses and these people. So the choices they make about whether to ask these people, whether to inquire, whether to undertake the due diligence to figure out if their business models are relying on illegal forced labor and human trafficking, those are crucial. If we don't ask those questions, then the system that we're all putting our pension savings into and so on, it's relying on business models that have baked into them something we've said is illegal at all times in all places. So we're now seeing a number of different jurisdictions in different ways, whether it's the US Customs and Border protection system of trade detention, whether it's the EU in its trade agreements. We're seeing a number of jurisdictions ask these questions of businesses, and maybe that's something we can come back to later. And then the third area is financial inclusion. People who are already vulnerable because they're the wrong gender or the wrong caste, or because they've been displaced, or they have uncertain or unconfirmed, unresolved migration status, they're all vulnerable. They're more likely to become vulnerable to trafficking, to actually fall into trafficking, if they don't have access to safe, reliable financial services. Simple things such as savings, or of course, credit. If you don't have access to reliable credit, you're more likely to take dangerous choices in the labor market. You're more likely to undertake risky, dangerous, and unsafe journeys in search of work. So these are all ways in which the financial sector has a role to play. For example, by extending safe services to these people, we can improve their access to safe, reliable services and reduce their risk of being trafficked. So I'll leave it there for now, Chantal, but really looking forward to hearing more from the panel and to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Leila, you've been queued up. But I also want to ask you, so talk a little bit about the role of corruption, but I also want to ask you about the sort of similarities and differences of other illegal trade. You know, is this really something different, or is it, as Jamila seemed to indicate earlier, you know, one reinforces the other? Leila?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chantal. Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank WISE and my fellow panelists for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Today, I'll address 3 issues: the convergence of human trafficking with other forms of illicit trade, as Chantal mentions, the role of corruption and other root causes of trafficking in humans, and the role of technology in both facilitating and countering this trade. So my research at the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center involves investigating the trafficking of humans, antiquities, wildlife, and narcotics. Each of these crimes threatens security and contributes to destructive Black markets. We've also found that the actors and networks involved in these transnational crimes often overlap. So what are the similarities and differences of human trafficking as compared with other illicit trades? Well, organized criminal networks often share trade routes and tactics. The source, transit, and destination countries for these trades are often the same. And we find that demand for trafficked humans, antiquities, and narcotics are highest in the US and the West. So if we can reduce demand in the US and in other destination countries, this would lower the rewards and incentives for traffickers. These trades also use open and dark web to conduct business and transactions. Less explicitly illegal trades like wildlife and antiquities do not need to use the dark web, unlike human trafficking. Trade on the dark web, I should also mention, requires a higher level of technical skill than open web trafficking. We also see evidence of the use of cryptocurrencies and various financial crimes, such as bribery, fraud, and money laundering. This convergence demonstrates a need to share information on transnational criminal networks in order to effectively detect and disrupt illicit trade. Corruption is one of the root causes of human trafficking, along with gender inequality and economic insecurity. Crimes like human trafficking cannot occur without the presence of widespread corruption. The trafficking in persons for sex and labor requires corruption and collusion at various levels. So for example, we see the bribing of Customs and Border Patrol, the falsification and forgery of documents such as passports or other travel identification. So any effort to successfully eliminate trafficking in humans must involve eradicating the root causes of gender and economic inequality, as well as systemic corruption. On a positive note, this corruption leaves a gap in the enforcement of public security and safety that's often filled by civil society. So one example of this would be HarassMap, which is an initiative in Egypt that maps instances of sexual assault to prevent and document harassment that's left unaddressed by the state. And it's become clear that traffickers use technology and social media to conduct their trade. But I think what's important here is that we must clearly define what we mean by technology. Are we talking about information communication technology? Are we talking about geospatial data? Are we talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning? So at a sort of basic level, text messaging and geolocation can be used by traffickers to track their victims. And probably most importantly, social media is used to gather information on victims. We post so much about ourselves, our interests, our hobbies, basically our whole lives online, which allows traffickers to collect detailed information before even contacting a potential victim. So then once they've targeted their potential victim, traffickers have all the information they need to establish trust, a critical component for recruitment and grooming. We've also seen that traffickers use online platforms to advertise and sell pornographic content, often of underage victims. At the same time, I think it's really important that we be careful not to overemphasize the role of social media or technology. Many instances of modern day slavery occur offline without the use of technology through personal connections and relationships. So it's important to point out that social media is often only one part of the supply chain. Criminals have capitalized on the chaos caused by COVID-19. High levels of unemployment and homelessness leave many vulnerable to being exploited and trafficked. The ILO estimates that the lockdowns of 2020 have affected a staggering 2.7 billion workers, or 81% of the world's workforce. We also see a sharp increase in instances of domestic assault and violence. So to end on sort of a positive note, there are many ways that we can use technology to combat trafficking, as I'm sure Hannah will point out in a moment. For example, TRAC has its Human Trafficking Hackathon, which is an innovation incubator that produces cutting-edge technological solutions for detecting and combating human trafficking. A 48-hour event, participants work with partner technology companies to develop practical solutions. And you can learn more about TRAC's Human Trafficking Hackathon at trac.gmu.edu. During TRAC's Antiquities Trafficking Grant, I worked with software that stemmed from DARPA's MEMEX project, which used state-of-the-art content indexing and web searching to counter modern day slavery. So as we can see, technology can be used by both sides, and we need to be as creative and innovative with our solutions as criminals are in this trade. Thanks.
Thank you, Leila. Hannah, I would like to ask you about, what kind of tech are we talking about, as Leila said, and talk a little bit about the Tech Against Trafficking initiative, because with you, I actually want to move a little bit into the responses. We'll do a quick round because I think the number of questions are increasing. So Hannah, the role of tech. in human trafficking, and what about this initiative, Tech Against Trafficking?
Great, thank you so much, Sean. Happy to dig into that, but first just want to thank you and the other panelists. It's such an honor to be on here today and really looking forward to further discussion. So as you know, my name is Hannah Darton. I'm an Associate Director of Ethics, Technology, and Human Rights here at BSR, a Business for Social Responsibility. And here at BSR, we host a number of collaborative initiatives where our member companies can come and focus their efforts and energies, their resources around specific topics. I actually serve as the Secretary of Tech Against Trafficking Initiative. So that's just a bit of context and background on where I'm coming from. But Tech Against Trafficking is a coalition of technology companies, including Amazon, AT&T, BT or British Telecom, Microsoft, and Salesforce, that are collaborating with global experts to help eradicate human trafficking using technology. Launched in 2018, the goal of Tech Against Trafficking is really to work with civil society, law enforcement, academia, and survivors to identify and support tech solutions that disrupt and reduce human trafficking, that help prevent and identify crimes, and that provide remedy mechanisms for victims and survivors. So to start getting at your question, Chantal, to inform the development of Tech Against Trafficking and our long-term strategy, our first step was actually to map the landscape of existing technology tools being used to combat this issue. And together with partners, some of whom are on this call, we identified over 300 technology tools working in the anti-trafficking sector across a wide range of geographies, target users, and focus areas. And these tools range from simple mobile applications informing vulnerable communities, migrant workers that James was speaking to, and individuals of the risk of labor exploitation, to more advanced technologies such as satellite imagery, geospatial mapping tools that are being used to track down fishing vessels engaged in illegal activity. And then we also identified tools that are using facial recognition, blockchain, big data analysis, and visualization within this mapping exercise. And what we did was we actually published these findings from our landscape analysis in an interactive map on the Tech Against Trafficking website. And we partnered closely with the OSCE, or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to put out a seminal publication in June of this year on the use of technology to fight trafficking in human beings. And what we're really seeing is that beyond individual organizations, technology presents a massive opportunity for the broader anti-trafficking field. Technology can help disparate actors across geographies to share data and facilitate the identification of victims and traffickers. It can improve case management and survivor care and raise awareness amongst these at-risk communities. However, the other side of the coin, and what we're seeing, is that anti-trafficking, the ecosystem is so largely siloed at times, and collaboration and engagement between these organizations deploying these technologies is really minimal. And so we're seeing a lot of duplication of efforts, opportunities for new solutions that are missed due to a lack of information about similar efforts, and then the lack of shared or compatible data, along with nominal technology, infrastructure, and expertise, and a dearth of sustained funding and support. So as just a quick example, our landscape mapping actually identified over 70 tools, unique technology tools developed for the purpose of victim or trafficker identification. And if sharing and collaboration had happened earlier, we might have been able to pool that research and to what we call lift and shift these technology tools to new geographies, new applications, instead of reinventing the wheel here. So Tech Against Trafficking basically hopes to help support the work of these individual organizations looking to more effectively utilize and deploy technology to advance the scale of their work, while simultaneously creating the connective tissue, as we call it, to bring together organizations and technology tools operating across the anti-trafficking sector and lead them to systems level change. One of the ways in which we're doing this is through our Tech Against Trafficking Accelerator program. So back in 2019, which now feels like a decade ago, the Accelerator launched to really help advance and scale the work of select organizations deploying promising technology solutions by providing them with resources and support from our Tech Against Trafficking member companies, while building an ecosystem of actors that will provide ongoing support into the future for the participant organizations. And in that first Accelerator program, we CTDC, or the Counter Trafficking Data Collaborative, an initiative of the International Organization for Migration, to explore and promote best practices around data anonymization, privacy, and security. The Counter Trafficking Data Collaborative is the first global data on human trafficking that's publishing harmonized data for trafficking organizations around the world. And they were really finding that there were challenges around being able to share some of the data, the privacy mechanisms within that data set. And so we worked through privacy preserving work streams and data standards work streams to be able to help address some of the challenges and issues that they were facing. And I'm happy to go into deeper detail there, but I think I'll stop there for now, as I've given a little bit of the color to the Tech Against Trafficking initiative. And I think it would be worthwhile, as we continue this conversation, to also highlight just some of the key considerations to keep in mind as we think through the role of technology in fighting this fight. What works, but also when doesn't it work, and when can't we rely on technology? It's something we really have to be cognizant about, is trying to solve, think of it as an overarching solution. Well, really it's a tool in our toolbox that can be deployed in certain instances, but it needs to be complemented by many of the other support systems that the other panelists were discussing as well.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
for now.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And I'm also very happy to see that you're looking at tech as indeed a tool, because there are underlying issues that enable human trafficking are related to gender inequality very much, and we see the same sort of issues cropping up. And I think James, you said it, you know, we often think in terms of victim, perpetrator, and bystanders, but there are of course no neutral bystanders in this particular era, as in this particular arena, as there are when we're talking about gender inequality issues. Very briefly, a sort of quick reaction, what you think are the top reasons why we're not making more progress on the policy front to outlaw, or maybe we have outlawed, but why can't we implement the outlawing of human trafficking? What is hindering? What's the biggest obstacle here? And then we'll go to the Q&A, because there are a lot of interesting questions. So maybe very quickly, Jamil, what is for you the biggest obstacle to moving forward on this issue, or combating this issue?
Yeah. Well, okay, as we talked at the top, it is a, you know, we see it, and as James had noted, we see it in situations of vulnerability when somebody can be exploited. So that plays out in different ways. But I think if we look at some of the different actors, a couple of key points that I would make is first, the need to actually hold corporations accountable for the use of forced labor in their supply chains. So there are all kinds of work around transparency and due diligence, but there has not been there's not been sufficient measures with real teeth to actually incentivize and hold corporations accountable for doing the work to ensure that across their supply chains, across their subcontractors, and you know, all of their suppliers, that the system is not built on and is not profiting from forced labor and exploitation. So I think that's one piece, that we have the laws, but we don't have enforcement, and we don't have sufficient accountability. We see that, as I'm just noting, with corporations. We see it in the prosecution space as well, that the number of prosecutions are decreasing globally. And so there's a mix of ways to go after that. You know, part of that is to engage survivors at the outset, and to really be kind of focused on the needs of survivors, so that their perspectives are helping to shape cases. There's at least in the US, we see a kind of almost a tunnel vision focus on criminal charges, and not sufficient coordination looking at other civil liabilities, blocking the profits, sanctions, et cetera. There's not enough coordination across those communities to actually kind of pursue a comprehensive accountability effort. So those are kind of two sides on the accountability front. I think that there also isn't kind of sufficient attention to data, both to understand kind of what the different forms of vulnerabilities are, to understand that better, but especially on the programming side, to understand the effectiveness, what's working and what isn't that we've been investing in. You know, this is a challenge across sectors that we see kind of a growing focus on actually being more attuned, more invested in tracking the results of interventions and understanding why they worked or why they didn't work. And that's something we need to do more in the trafficking space. We're seeing that really pick up some in the last few years, but there is, again, real space to do that. Another piece I would say in the labor trafficking space is the need to regulate recruitment. This is an area where we see a lot of the risks for exploitation entering, including in the United States. We lack sufficient regulations on our recruitment systems here, the agencies and brokers that are recruiting workers. There's, when they're unregulated, unethical, it is a space where we're seeing a whole lot of exploitation occurring. Same with guest visas. With our visa system is another area where there needs to be reforms to help protect labor rights. So those are a few ideas.
Mm-hmm. Okay. James, to you the same question. And I also wanted to ask you, how did the financial sector actually reacted to the FAST initiative, and how deep has its cooperation been?
Yeah, well, look, I'll start there actually and work backwards, if I may, Chantal. This was in a sense the financial sector's idea. We started working, as Ambassador Yeager said, with a number of banks quite a while ago, 4 or 5 years ago, who were looking at this primarily from a criminal law, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing lens. But they were increasingly, the big banks were increasingly realizing that they had colleagues over in their sustainability section or in their even in their compliance sections who were finding they were dealing with similar or even exactly the same risk, but from a completely different perspective, and weren't sure what to make of that, weren't sure how much information they could share with each other. So these are people on the investment and deal-making side of the house. And that's where the conversation really started. As we went through working with microfinance and others, we realized there was also this financial inclusion angle. So the financial sector has been very responsive. We work with 13 major banks internationally to help them provide access to survivors to financial services to help reduce the risk of survivors being drawn back into trafficking. We're working with institutional investors with over $8 trillion assets under management to actively engage with the companies they invest in to find and address modern slavery risks in supply chains. And we recently launched a training with the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, which is available free online to anybody, actually. We released that in June. So in about 6 months, we've had about 5,500 financial sector professionals from 130 countries take that training, which is an indication of just how broadly the financial sector is beginning to recognize that this is a very real risk that they're dealing with. And so I want to come back to your original question, what's the blockage here? From the financial sector perspective and from the global economic perspective, the basic problem is that we have not told them that's a risk they need to factor into their risk processes. The financial sector is all about risk intermediation. That's what they do in the global economy. But we have told them, focus on financial risk. Our laws are written to tell them to maximize profits for shareholders in particular. over the last 10, 20 years, we've begun to realize there's another form of risk we need to factor in: climate risk, environmental risk. So we're recognizing that the externalities created by business models with bad environmental footprints actually are financially material and actually go to the sustainability of the business model. Well, this is similar. We're now recognizing if we don't require business and finance to look at labor risk in the same way, to think about the social externalities of the business models, then we're setting ourselves up for failure over the long term. And that's become especially apparent during the pandemic, because we've learned that supply chains that treat their workers poorly are not resilient in the same way that supply chains that treat their workers well. Now, what's interesting is the markets are now not waiting for the legislators to legislate this change. The markets are going there already. So we've seen a massive move of money into what's called ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance investing. It means investing that takes these externalized risk factors in. But there's a limit to what businesses can actually legally do there, because the laws still say, put the profits of your shareholders, put short-term profits over long-term sustainability. So we need to catch up. And from a policy perspective, there's a big mental frame adjustment we have to go through, big policy discussion. And as I said, there will be resistance. In the US, for example, we see the Department of Labor very resistant to pension funds taking these ESG factors into consideration in their investment decisions. That's just an example. There's a lot of work to do here to change that mental framing.
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, Laila or Hannah, anything you want to add? And then I want to go to our questions.
Yeah, I think there's a need to support civil society and other efforts to address these sort of root causes of trafficking in humans. These include socioeconomic and gender inequality, like we talked about before, as well as crisis, conflict, and general precarity or a lack of security. So we need to increase safety and security. And rather than viewing this as a purely human rights concern, which it absolutely is, we should look at the convergence with other forms of organized and transnational crime and view this more broadly as a national security and a public health concern. As I mentioned, we need to be as creative and innovative with our solutions as criminals are in conducting their business, train law enforcement and other personnel on how to identify and handle cases of sexual assault and trafficking, and to collaborate or partner with tech companies and have corporate responsibility, as you're mentioning, to detect and prevent these crimes. We can use technology to document and archive human rights abuses and allow state and non-state actors to learn from one another through collaboration and information sharing. As I mentioned, one of the underlying or structural conditions that create fertile ground for human trafficking are corruption. And sometimes officials are the ones that are actually perpetrating these crimes. For example, in Iran, we have sirez, which are temporary marriages. These can last anywhere from 3 days to 99 years. And this really legitimizes and legalizes brothels. And so in terms of data, I definitely agree with our panelists that we need better data. And as Hannah mentioned, more interoperable data. So data that actually can be used with, can be shared efficiently to measure these sort of root causes such as gender inequality at various levels. If I can make another plug, a great resource for this is Women's Stats. Their map on the low level of physical security for women worldwide is really eye-opening, including in the US. And in this way, we have a barometer for achieving gender equality, equal pay for women, increased socioeconomic and physical security. And one last thing I think is reducing demand. That will impact the supply chain. We must limit the incentives for engaging in this highly lucrative trade and increase the risks and lower the rewards involved in human trafficking.
Hannah?
Yeah, I'd love to plus one everything that was already said. I think there's a lot of great points there. And sorry, my technology is apparently stopping working right there. But I think to really pick up on what James was saying about the focus on ESG, I think this is something at BSR that we're seeing quite a bit as investors stepping in to think about how they can really encourage startup companies and investments that they're looking at to build in social considerations, to focus on environmental social issues. And increasingly, they're asking what questions they need to ask. How can they really be assured that companies are taking these actions, that their investments are sound? And how can they not only ask the questions, but support companies in their journey to actually integrating these considerations? And I think we're on the early stage of that journey, but we're seeing increasingly a focus on these issues and the interplay between investors and these companies. So that's one thing I'd say. I think that we also need to increasingly look at the interplay or the intersection between risks. So we've talked about climate risk and human rights risks, but that's a focus area that isn't necessarily coming to light as much as it should as of yet. And I think that companies and other actors throughout this ecosystem need to start looking at that intersection. You know, we have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which require companies to identify and take action to address the human rights impacts associated with their business. And we have things such as TCFD, the Task Force related on financial disclosures, that requires you to identify climate risks. But those two things don't intersect, and they easily could. We could overlap those lenses so that we look at the risk at that intersection, help to predict what could actually happen, and it would actually bring out the potential impacts to these areas such as human trafficking and allow us to create strategic resilient plans that would mitigate against human trafficking alongside other social risks. So I guess just saying that the more that we can look at these through complementary lenses to help us figure this out to a greater extent, the better. And then finally, my last point here would just be around, as much as we can think through how to be more effective and efficient in the way that we're bringing resources into this sector. So looking at what already exists, building off the lessons learned, and looking at how we can build up infrastructure that will allow these initiatives to be successful. And that might be longer term. That might mean getting internet so these technologies can be deployed, not just funding the work itself. So building up the ways in which these environments can be created to support healthy initiatives that will help tackle this issue.
Okay, thank you very much. Susie or Maeve, I think it's Susie. Give us some of the questions that are in the Q&A.
Yeah, so we have a lot of questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. One question our audience had was on the point around financial inclusion. What impact do you think a financial service aimed at those who fall into the category of financially excluded would have on trafficking and exploitation? And on the same note, in addition, obviously, the current global economy has been strongly affected due to COVID-19. So what will be the overall impact of this on human trafficking?
Okay, why don't you give us two more?
Yeah, so another talked about changes in the pandemic and that it's been a catalyst for a number of new challenges, one of these being QAnon conspiracy theories around countering human trafficking. And it's really manipulated this to increase the reliance on technology. So are there any upcoming initiatives that address or prevent challenges such as the ones posed by QAnon?
Okay. James, maybe, and Laila, the QAnon. James?
Yeah, so I'll take the financial inclusion question, which is a great question. So as we were talking about, anybody who's vulnerable already to being exploited, the chance that they actually end up in trafficking increases when they go through a financial crisis. And the basis of that financial crisis could be very varied. It could be that you're a subsistence farmer and you've just had an unexpected weather event which has wiped out your crop. Now, unexpected weather events are becoming more and more common, more and more expected, I guess you could say these days, thanks to global heating. It could be that you are living in the Midwest and you have a sudden health crisis and you don't have access to health insurance or healthcare. So then you have to have income somehow, you sell your labor in a risky way. That's a very common story. These are both real life examples I'm drawing on. It could simply be that you have to pay for a wedding. In many cultures, that's probably one of the largest financial burdens a family will ever bear and well beyond their normal cash flow. So they have to take on debt. All of these things lead people to take on financial risk in ways that they normally can't. And if you don't have access to a well-regulated, safe, reasonable interest rate loan facility, then you're going to go to someone that colloquially we describe as a loan shark. And if they're a loan shark, it's only often a couple of steps down the road and you're in debt bondage. What we mean by that is you're being asked to repay a debt on terms that are not reasonable and that actually just deepen your debt and that just lead you deeper and deeper and deeper into the debt trap. Debt bondage is the #1 form of modern slavery and human trafficking in the world, statistically speaking. And because it's not legal to hold somebody as property anymore, you can't use property law as the mechanism for enslaving someone. You use debt instead. You use employment contracts or you use the marriage contract. Slavery has shifted from property law to all these other forms of contracts. So well-regulated financial services and giving that them to people who are unbanked. There are 1.2 billion people in the world, most of them women, who don't have access to a basic bank account. We can do that now through digital technology. And we can do it because the model has changed. We don't need someone to have access to property as collateral. Instead, we can simply look, for example, at the way they store their contacts in their mobile phone. That tells us more accurately about their likelihood of repaying a loan than whether they own property ever did. So technology is a massive game changer here. And what that means is we can go to the financial industry, and in fact, FAST is doing this, and say, if you provide these services to these people, it's lucrative for you and it has measurable social impact. Now, there may be an upfront cost to generate those services in a way that's useful for you, but investors, back to Hannah's point, investors are looking for investments that pay and that also have positive, measurable social impact. There's a huge flood of capital into this area. So this is a massive growth area.
Leila, do you want to address the QAnon issue?
Or I think just generally COVID-19 has made it so that we're all online much more, maybe more than we want to be. And it's creating a lot more vulnerabilities and opportunities for mis and disinformation. We have to be kind of careful in distinguishing between these disinformation being, strategically trying to misinform for a particular purpose. And once these sort of falsehoods are established, they spread really quickly and they're often really difficult to stop. Like I mentioned before, criminals have absolutely capitalized on the chaos caused by COVID-19. There are high levels of unemployment and homelessness, leaving lots of people very vulnerable. And like I said before, I think that we have to be really careful about what we mean by technology. Here, we're specifically talking about the internet, but I saw that there was another question about social media. And so as much as I pointed out how traffickers use social media to conduct this type of trade, I think it's also important to not overemphasize this role of social media or technology, as I mentioned, because a lot of this trade is happening locally, right? So it's not all international trade. It's not people crossing borders. It's also within borders, and that can be quite lucrative as well. So there are lots of instances where this doesn't necessarily happen online.
Okay. Susie, let me get back to you for some more questions.
Yeah, so another great question we had from our audience said, can you speak to the relationship between sex work technology and human trafficking? For example, the impact that the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act bill has had on the safety of sex workers. And then another question we had was talking about how in the United States, the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery and forced labor, explicitly doesn't apply to prison labor. And as a result, businesses are free to legally hire and coerce inmates into working without adherence to labor laws. So our audience members wanted to ask you if anti-human trafficking and slavery policies apply to this type of exploitation as well.
Okay, maybe Jamila, for you, the sex work and human trafficking.
Yes, so great to raise the Basta Sesta laws, the U.S. laws focusing on allowing states and victims to fight online sex trafficking act. So this is crucial. and a big change to actually hold websites that host sex trafficking ads accountable, and is a big space to say that there's no longer just straight impunity by websites and others for what's hosted on their sites. And it's something, certainly we've kind of seen the conversation pick up as we look at kind of more, there's been focus on sites such as Pornhub kind of focused more specifically on this industry, but it's important, and there's some great researchers doing work in the space kind of highlighting the fact that the amount of content being sold just straight on Google or YouTube or other just kind of mainstream sites, it's critical that we aren't just looking at sites like Pornhub as we kind of crack down on content, but are recognizing that this kind of content and online sexual exploitation is occurring across the internet. And it's something too where we add the COVID-19 lens to this, and the point that we now are more online. We've seen, and less in person, so we've seen sexual exploitation increase online. We've seen the resources to take down content has dropped. So there's been a drop in the amount of content being taken down. We also see an increase in child sexual exploitation, that you now have more kids online doing, whether it's remote school or just, doing screen time without, not being monitored closely as their parents try to work or something, that we now see an increase as well in online sexual exploitation of children occurring. So it is kind of very important that we have tools like Fosta Sesta and others that are actually trying to, crack down on this and increase regulation. And there's much more to be done in this space. And this is, I think, some great work that's being done by folks like Danielle Citron and Marianne Franks that I would point you to.
Okay, thank you very much. We're coming to the end, and I want to sort of ask all of you to not to conclude this session, but as some remarks for our audience to take away is, what are the one or two things you would really like to see happen in the next 6-12 months? If you had the ear of our new US president, for instance, what are the kinds of things you would want to see happen at the US level or at a global level? And I'll start with you, James, and then we'll go and do a round. James.
Yeah, I'd like to see the US government follow through on its existing commitments under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that Hannah mentioned. Women's rights are human rights. And if business in America really followed through on that, it would address many of the issues that we've discussed today, including the prison labor issue. Whatever the American Constitution says, there are international standards that the US government is aware of and committed to that are relevant there. I think we'd see a sea change in American capital if it followed through on that. We've heard from the Business Roundtable that they're willing to make rhetorical commitments to things like quote unquote stakeholder capitalism. That's terrific. Now it's time to put their money where their mouths are, frankly, and the US government has not just the bully pulpit, but the regulatory capability, the legislative reach to hold their feet to the fire on that.
Okay,
thanks, Chantal.
Thank you, Hannah.
Yes, I think I would agree with James that I'd love to see a further emphasis put on the commitments under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and that we conduct due diligence, human rights due diligence, climate risk due diligence, and other forms of due diligence on the use technology, but also other initiatives that are being deployed to combat human trafficking, really understanding the risk and how we can address them from a company level, from a government level, from all the levels needed to really address this from a multi-pronged approach would be needed. And then the other thing I'd say is just setting up an environment for supportive creativity and innovation. So allowing for considerations of what would amplify some of these innovative ways to address this problem and give a little bit of flexibility so that we can actually explore step change solutions within this field.
Okay, thank you. Leila?
Yeah, I think I'd like to reemphasize this need to address the root causes. So addressing gender inequality, socioeconomic inequality, as well as corruption. And I didn't mention as much of this, but even just online harassment and sort of the structural issues that really propel and facilitate this kind of crime. I would second a lot of the panelists that have spoken today about the need to collaborate and partner with tech, encourage corporate responsibility to prevent these crimes, using technology to document human rights abuses, and then again, pushing for a sharing of data and, collaborating across different forms of transnational crime, not just in human trafficking, but with these other types of transnational crime that I mentioned today.
Great. And Jamila, as a former policymaker, what would be your advice?
I do think that it would be helpful to increase the accountability tools that we have in the US government. So there are some interesting ideas and work, for example, going on around adapting the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which introduced penalties and enforcement mechanisms that incentivize US-based corporations to fight corruption and bribery globally, of taking that same model and expanding it to address a range of human rights issues, including modern slavery and human trafficking. But the idea that being kind of one model of a way to, again, increase the accountability measures and the potential liability to try to really shift major corporations' attention to human trafficking in their supply chains. It's something that we're seeing in the last few years, where we see kind of the Tariff Act started to be used more effectively to block the importation of goods made with forced labor into US markets. That's kind of another tool that has real, that gets the attention of corporations, and that really can be used to try to really incentivize a change in behavior across supply chains to ensure that we are then implementing the commitments that have been made around protecting business and human rights and labor rights and freedom of association, et cetera, across the goods that we then, all buy in the United States. So being able to really ensure that the market is free of forced labor, of modern slavery. Trade is another way of going about that. There's conversations of different mechanisms and processes to be able to use at the WTO to try to advance really move the conversation forward there on labor standards, which is another kind of space of really trying to look at how do we tackle forced labor as a kind of feature across our economic system right now.
Okay, thank you very much. I wish we had another hour, but we said we would end this at 5:15. And so I would like to thank our panelists for their remarks and interventions. And I would like to say to our audience, stay tuned, because I think we have just started the conversation, and we will probably want to continue this conversation in the new year. And certainly, James, when your new book is coming out, we would like to give you a platform to talk about that, and Jamila with your study group. Meanwhile, thank you all for participating, and I wish all of you a very happy and safe end of the year, and hope to see you in 2021. So again, thank you very much, and stay tuned for more on this issue. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.